Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be tackling something that I think is super relevant to a lot of us, especially those of us who are ambitious and driven. We're going to be talking about ego.
And how it can really hold us back.
Yeah, exactly.
And for this deep dive, we're going to be using Ego is the Enemy by Ryan Holiday.
Yeah, it's a great book. And it really explores how this ego, can sabotage our success.
In all areas of life, aspiration, success, even in failure.
That's right. And, we've all experienced it, right? I mean, that feeling of self-doubt or even, maybe overconfidence that can kind of trip us up. Sometimes it feels like we get in our own way.
Mm-hmm.
And so Holiday, he starts the book talking about what he calls the perils of talk. And he uses this really interesting story to illustrate his point. It's about Upton Sinclair.
Oh, yeah.
Upton Sinclair.
Yep.
Back in 1934.
Ran for governor of California.
That's right, yeah. So during that campaign, he wrote a book, and it was called I, Governor of California, and How I Ended Poverty.
Sounds pretty standard for a political campaign.
Right, exactly. Except he wrote the entire thing in the past tense.
Like he had already won.
Yeah. As if he had already won and implemented all these policies.
Yeah, and people at the time, observers, noticed this had this weird effect on him.
It's like he lost interest almost.
Yeah, he almost lost interest in campaigning.
Yeah.
He'd already lived it out in his head.
It was like he talked himself out of actually winning.
And he ended up losing.
Right. And so, I think that's, a really powerful example. And it makes me think about today's world and how, social media really is. It's all about presenting this perfect, curated version of ourselves.
Yeah.
This highlight reel. And I think, even when we're struggling behind the scenes, there's this pressure to project this image of, success and we have it all figured out.
Right. And that pressure to project that perfect image, I think, can actually fuel our ego.
Oh, absolutely.
And it distracts us from the real work that we need to do.
Right. It's like we get caught up in appearances.
We're focused on how things look to other people rather than, actually accomplishing things.
Yeah. And so we risk falling into this trap of prioritizing talk over action. Absolutely. We're all writing our own, I, Governor of California stories on Instagram or Twitter.
For sure.
But Holiday, he offers this really interesting historical counterpoint. And it's William Tecumseh Sherman.
Oh, yeah.
The Civil War general.
The Civil War general. Now, I got to admit, when I learned about Sherman in school, I don't remember him being like this ego-driven maniac.
No, not at all. He actually embodies the opposite.
Really?
How humility and this focus on doing rather than talking can actually lead to extraordinary success.
Interesting.
So this guy Sherman, you're saying he was actually humble, like a Civil War general being humble? That's kind of unexpected. I mean, that seems like a pretty intense environment,
Yeah. It's fascinating, right? Because Sherman, despite his later success, wasn't like some natural born leader, overflowing with confidence. Like early in the war, he really struggled with self-doubt, even had these bouts of paranoia. There's this story of him having a bit of a breakdown and actually getting relieved of command temporarily.
Oh, wow. Okay, that's not exactly the image of a, stoic, unshakable military genius I had in mind.
Right. But that's what makes his humility so interesting, I think. He didn't let those setbacks crush him. Instead, he recognized his weaknesses and adapted and kept going. And I think one of the most striking examples of this egoless approach is actually his relationship with Ulysses S. Grant.
Oh, yeah, Grant, the ultimate victor of the Civil War.
Exactly. And Sherman, even though he outranked Grant, at one point he chose to wholeheartedly support him. Instead of getting caught up in vying for power or recognition, he basically said, "This is your show, Grant. I'm here to help."
That's wild. I mean, you don't often hear about that kind of selflessness, especially in a context like war, where the stakes are so high. Makes you wonder, what can we learn from that, even, outside a military setting?
That's what I love about these historical examples. They provide these really rich insights. I think what's interesting here is that Sherman's most celebrated achievements, like his famous March to the Sea, were actually rooted in this really unglamorous work he had done years earlier, scouting and meticulously studying terrain that everyone else thought was insignificant.
So he wasn't about the flashy strategies or, seeking glory. He was all about, laying the groundwork, mastering the details, and then executing with precision. I love that. It really challenges that whole idea of overnight success, doesn't it?
It really does.
Yeah.
And I think that's where Holiday's critique of our modern culture comes in.
Yeah.
Because, we're constantly bombarded with these messages about believing in ourselves and chasing our dreams and never giving up. And while, those things can be really motivating, they can also lead to this kind of delusional self-confidence that's not grounded in reality.
Oh, yeah, totally. It's like we're encouraged to have this unwavering faith in ourselves even before we've actually done anything to warrant that faith. It's like we're supposed to manifest our success through sheer willpower or something.
Right. And that's a dangerous game to play, because Holiday reminds us facts are better than dreams. It's about being honest with ourselves, acknowledging our strengths and weaknesses, and then putting in the hard work to actually achieve something tangible.
So instead of getting caught up in, fantasies of who we could be, it's about focusing on the actions that will actually get us there, shifting from the hype to the real concrete effort. But how do we actually cultivate that kind of like grounded self-awareness? It's so easy to get caught up in our own hype, especially when, the world is constantly telling us how great we are.
That's where the work begins. It's about detaching from our work just enough to see it objectively, to be open to feedback, even when it's critical. We need to surround ourselves with people who will challenge us to grow, not just those who are going to inflate our egos.
Yeah, it's about being receptive to those, tough lessons. I know it's easy to get defensive when you feel like your work is being criticized, but sometimes that criticism is exactly what we need to push ourselves further.
Exactly. Holiday's point isn't about like tearing ourselves down or denying our potential. It's about creating this space where honest self-assessment can flourish so that we can actually reach our full potential.
This is making me think about all those times when I've been guilty of, hyping myself up before I actually accomplish anything. I mean, it's a tough cycle to break, but it seems like such a crucial part of mastering our ego.
Yeah, and what's really striking to me about Sherman's story is that even after achieving all this incredible success, he remained grounded. He actively avoided the spotlight, rejected political opportunities, and always emphasized staying true to himself. It's like he understood that real fulfillment comes from the work itself, not from like external validation or accolades.
That's such a good point. It reminds us that we have the power to define success on our own terms. Like we can choose to focus on what truly matters to us, regardless of, what everyone else is saying or doing. And it brings us right back to Holiday's core argument. Ego is the enemy.
Right.
It's that voice in our heads that's telling us we're better than we are, that we deserve special treatment, that the rules don't apply to us. Yeah, and if we let that voice run wild, it can be really self-sabotaging, no matter how talented or successful we are. So how do we actually tame that, inner ego monster?
Well, Holiday offers some really practical strategies. And one is to cultivate a mindset of continuous learning. We need to be humble enough to admit that we don't have all the answers, that there's always room for improvement.
So being open to feedback, even when it's tough to hear. And, seeking out mentors or role models who will really challenge us to grow.
Exactly. And it's also about detaching from our work just enough to see it objectively. Because when we're too emotionally invested, our ego can really cloud our judgment.
Well, it's so easy to get defensive, right? When we feel like our work is being criticized. But, sometimes that criticism is exactly what we need to hear to really level up.
Absolutely. And I think ultimately it's about remembering that our work is not our identity. Mm-hmm. Like we are more than our accomplishments, our failures, or even our successes. And that can be really freeing.
Yeah, it takes the pressure off, having to constantly prove ourselves. We can actually focus on, the joy of creating the satisfaction of doing something well, regardless of whether anyone else notices or not.
For sure. So as we wrap up this deep dive into ego's the enemy, I think the key takeaway here is this. We all have an ego. It's part of being human.
Right.
But we have a choice. We can let it control us, or we can learn to control it.
And if we choose the latter, if we can learn to manage our ego, I think it opens us up to a world of possibilities. We can achieve great things, not in spite of our ego, but because we've learned to work with it, to use it as like a tool for growth, not a weapon of self-destruction.
I love that. A tool for growth, not a weapon of self-destruction. So here's a final thought for you all. Think about one area in your life where your ego might be holding you back. It could be a project you've been putting off, a relationship that needs repair, or a fear that you haven't faced.
What's one small step you can take today to shift from that talk and self-promotion to action and genuine growth? How would you approach that challenge with Sherman's quiet confidence and that unwavering focus on doing the work? That's the challenge, listeners. Go forth and conquer your ego.
We'll be here cheering you on.
Until next time, keep diving deep and keep learning.